He stumbled through the doorway, his face drained of all color, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The school principal could barely form words. He looked at the neighbor and all he could say was, "I know she's dead. I know she's dead." Inside that condominium, on a cold December morning just 4 days before Christmas, lay the body of a beloved 6th grade teacher. Her name was Christy Mirack. She was 25 years old, and the man who took her life was about to vanish into the community for more than 26 years. This is the Untold Cold Case. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button right now, tap the like button, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Your support keeps these stories alive and ensures that victims like Christy are never forgotten. What makes this case especially disturbing is that the man responsible wasn't hiding in some distant city. He was right there in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, living openly, smiling, performing as a disc jockey. He was a popular DJ of Puerto Rican descent, well known throughout the area. He went by the name DJ Freeze. Every weekend he performed at weddings and nightclubs, celebrating life while carrying a dark secret. And while he built his career, Christy's mother was battling cancer. She desperately hoped to live long enough to see justice for her daughter. But time ran out. In 2002, 10 years after Christy's murder, her mother passed away. She died never knowing who had killed her daughter. So how does this happen? How does a killer live among the very community he terrorized for 26 years? And why did it take revolutionary genetic technology and a piece of discarded chewing gum to finally unmask him? Today, we're going back to December 21st, 1992. We're walking through every frustrating dead end and every breakthrough that led to the truth. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. Long before she became a headline, Christy Mirack was just a girl with a dream that never wavered. Shamokin, Pennsylvania, in the late 1960s was a quiet mountain town where everyone knew everyone. It was here that Christy Mirack was born on November 3, 1967. She was the middle child of 3. Her brother Vince would later describe her as possessing iron-willed stubbornness and infectious kindness. She was the spark of the household, the one who could lift the mood with a joke or smile. But even as a child, Christy already knew what she wanted to be, a teacher. Not maybe, not someday. She was going to be a teacher. This wasn't a passing phase. When she played with her siblings, the games were always the same. Christy was the teacher. Her brother and sister were the students. She would line them up in the living room and conduct lessons with a seriousness that was almost prophetic. In 1985, Christy graduated from high school and enrolled at Millersville University of Pennsylvania, about 85 miles from her family. She studied primary education, learning how to reach struggling students and challenge those who excelled. When she walked across that graduation stage, it wasn't just a diploma. It was the fulfillment of a lifelong promise she had made to herself. By 1992, Christy had found her place. She was a 6th grade teacher at Rohrerstown Elementary School in Lancaster County. She was 25 years old and thriving. Her principal, Harry Goodman, observed something special in her. He saw a teacher who possessed a natural connection with her students. She didn't just teach them, she understood them. She made them feel like what they had to say mattered. And there was something else about Christy that stood out. She was never late, not once. In a profession where timing is everything, Christy Mirack was always exactly where she was supposed to be, exactly when she was supposed to be there. Her colleagues could set their watches by her. Parents knew their children were in good hands. So when December 21st, 1992 arrived, a cold Monday morning just 2 days before winter break, and Christy Mirack's classroom stood empty, Principal Harry Goodman knew immediately that something was wrong. The winter of 1992 had settled in with the kind of cold that makes every breath visible. Inside Rohrerstown Elementary School, the hallways buzzed with excited children counting down to holiday break. December 21st was a Monday, just 2 more days until vacation. But as the clock ticked past the start of the school day, one classroom remained empty. Christy Mirack had not arrived. By 8:45 in the morning, Principal Harry Goodman was standing in his office, staring at the phone, worry tightening in his chest. He dialed Christy's home number. The phone rang and rang. Then her answering machine picked up. He left a message. He waited. He called again. Same result. He called a third time, a fourth, a fifth. 5 separate calls, all going to her answering machine. Finally, Harry called Christy's mother in Shamokin, about 2 hours north. The conversation was brief, but it confirmed what Harry already suspected. Christy's mother said her daughter would never be late for work. She would never miss a day without calling. If Christy wasn't at school, something was seriously wrong. Harry explained that Christy had no local family in Lancaster, no one nearby who could check on her. So Harry made a decision. He would drive to her residence himself. He arrived at the East Lampeter Township condominium complex shortly after 9 o'clock. The first thing he noticed sent a chill through him. Christy's car was sitting in the driveway. The windows were completely covered with thick, undisturbed ice. The kind of ice that tells you the vehicle hasn't been touched since the previous evening. Harry walked toward the front entrance, and then he saw something that made his heart drop. The front door was not fully closed. It stood slightly open. Harry hesitated for just a moment. Every instinct told him he was about to step into something terrible. But he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was still. The silence was heavy. As his eyes adjusted, Harry moved farther into the home. And then, at approximately 9:30 in the morning, Harry Goodman found her. Christy's body was lying on the living room floor. The shock was immediate and overwhelming. Harry didn't process details. His brain simply registered the horror, and his body reacted. He turned and fled from the house, stumbling back outside. He began pounding on doors of the surrounding units, desperate, frantic, shouting for help. Finally, a neighbor opened their door. Harry barely got the words out. He needed to call 911. He needed help right now. Within 6 minutes, police cruisers were pulling into the complex, lights flashing, officers rushing toward Christy's home. What Harry Goodman witnessed that morning would follow him for years, triggering recurring nightmares that would require professional therapy to process. When responding officers entered Christy Mirack's condominium, they found her lying on the living room carpet, just to the right of the entrance. What they saw told a story of violence and struggle. Christy had sustained severe facial injuries. Her face was swollen and bruised, marked by blunt force trauma. There were deep, visible marks around her neck, unmistakable signs that she had been strangled. She was unclothed from the waist down, except for her socks. Her upper clothing had been pulled up above her chest. Based on the positioning and the state of her clothing, officers immediately understood this was not just a murder. Christy had been sexually assaulted before she was killed. There were no signs of forced entry at the front door. The lock was intact. This suggested Christy may have opened the door willingly, perhaps, recognizing her attacker. But the interior told a different story. There were clear markers of a struggle. Scratches marked the floor near the entrance. The door frame bore similar marks. The struggle had begun at the entrance and moved into the living room. Near Christy's head, investigators found a wooden cutting board lying on the carpet. Resting on top of it was a toaster. Forensic analysis would later reveal the horrifying truth. The cutting board had been used as a weapon to beat her. Detectives also discovered biological fluids on the carpet near the body. These fluids would become the most critical piece of evidence in the entire investigation. The investigators carefully cut out the stained section of carpet and collected Christy's sweater and shirt. All were sent to the Pennsylvania State Police Laboratory for testing. While the crime scene team worked inside, detectives began interviewing neighbors. One woman's testimony would prove crucial. She told investigators she had been walking her dog at approximately 7:15 that morning. She noticed a white car parked across from Christy's condominium. She described it as similar to a Dodge Daytona with black shutters over the rear window. As she watched, a man exited the vehicle and walked toward Christy's residence. She described him as white, muscular, with dark hair. At the time, she thought nothing of it. But now, in the context of a murder investigation, her casual observation became a critical lead. The investigation also established a narrow timeline. Christy's roommate had left for work at 7 o'clock that morning, exactly as she did every weekday. Shortly after 7:15, the woman walking her dog encountered the roommate outside. They spoke briefly, and then, during their conversation, both women heard something that made them pause. A loud, high-pitched scream. It came from the direction of Christy's condominium. At the time, neither woman could be certain who had screamed or what it meant. But now, looking back, the timing was chillingly precise. Cristy typically left for work between 7:30 and 7:45 in the morning. Police believed the attacker had timed his assault to occur during the narrow window when Cristy was home alone. Somewhere between 7:15 and 7:30 on the morning of December 21st, 1992, someone had entered Cristy's home, attacked her, assaulted her, and strangled her to death. And then, that person simply walked away. At 11 o'clock that morning, investigators from the Lancaster County Police Department made a phone call to the Mirack family in Shamokin. They were faced with an impossible situation. Vince Mirack and his mother were 2 hours away. If the police told them over the phone that Cristy had been murdered, they would have to endure that devastating news while driving. So the investigators chose to be vague. They told the family that Cristy had been involved in an accident. They said the family needed to come to Lancaster immediately. They provided no other details, no explanations, no reassurances, just urgency, an accident. That was all they were given. Vince Mirack and his mother got into the car and began the 2-hour drive south. The silence inside that vehicle was suffocating. An accident could mean anything. But why were the police being so vague? Why wouldn't they explain? The questions multiplied with every passing mile, but neither Vince nor his mother dared to voice the worst possibility. Not yet. Not out loud. Vince would later describe those 2 hours as the longest of his life. Every minute stretched into an eternity, filled with a growing sense of dread. When they finally arrived in Lancaster, they were met by investigators who took them to a quiet room. And then, finally, the truth. Cristy had not been injured. She had not been in an accident. She had been murdered. The word hung in the air like a physical thing, impossible to comprehend. Murdered. Their Cristy. The girl who had always wanted to be a teacher. The woman who was never late, who made her students smile. Murdered. The investigators asked if the family wanted to see her. They explained that arrangements could be made for a viewing. Vince and his mother said yes. Of course they said yes. How could they not? They were taken to a room where Cristy lay on a table, her face bearing the marks of violence. Vince and his mother stood just steps away, close enough to see her, close enough to reach out. But they were told they could not touch her. Cristy's mother moved forward instinctively, as any parent would. Her hand reached out toward her daughter, but an officer gently raised his hand and stopped her. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "You can't touch her. She's evidence." Evidence. Her daughter was evidence now. The moment was brief, but it carried the weight of absolute finality. Cristy was no longer someone they could comfort or hold. She belonged to the investigation now. For Vince, the image of his mother standing so close to her child yet forbidden from touching her would remain one of the most painful memories of that day. On December 22nd, the day after the discovery, a man walked into Rohrerstown Elementary School and asked to speak with Christy Mirack. The staff members who greeted him were immediately unsettled. By this point, Cristy's murder had been all over the local news. How could anyone connected to Cristy not know what had happened? While one staff member kept the man talking, another quietly called the police. When officers arrived, the man was identified as Daniel Daddario. He was in his 40s, married, and nearly 20 years older than Cristy. And according to him, he had been Cristy's boyfriend for the past 2 years. This revelation stunned the investigators. Cristy's family had known nothing about Daniel. Her colleagues had never heard her mention him. For 2 years, Cristy had been carrying on a relationship she kept entirely secret. Daniel agreed to go to the station for questioning. As the interview unfolded, a complicated picture began to emerge. Daniel explained that he and Cristy had met at a bar in Lancaster. The relationship had developed over time, but it was complicated. Daniel was married. He had a wife. The relationship existed in the shadows, hidden from public view. According to Daniel, the relationship had recently ended. He told investigators that on December 19th, just 2 days before Cristy was killed, she had broken up with him. Her reasoning was simple and heartbreaking. Cristy wanted a traditional future. She wanted a family of her own. She wanted to get married, to have children, to build a life that wasn't hidden, and Daniel, already married, could not give her that. Daniel claimed that after the breakup, Cristy had stopped answering his calls. He said he went to the school on December 22nd simply because he was worried. To the investigators, Daniel immediately became a prime suspect. In cases involving the murder of a young woman, intimate partners are statistically the most likely perpetrators. Add the fact that Cristy had just broken up with him, and Daniel had both motive and opportunity. But as detectives dug deeper, Daniel's alibi began to hold up. He told investigators that on the morning of December 21st, he had been moving to Virginia to be with his wife. He provided documentation showing he had been at a government office that morning, updating his vehicle registration and driver's license. When detectives verified the timestamps, the story checked out. Daniel had been at the government office when Cristy was being attacked. He agreed to take a polygraph test. He passed. He agreed to provide a DNA sample. The sample was compared to the biological fluids found at the crime scene. There was no match. After days of intense scrutiny, Daniel Daddario was eliminated as a suspect. The investigators were back to square one. While Daniel Daddario was being cleared, the Lancaster County medical examiner, Dr. Wayne Ross, was performing Christy Mirack's autopsy. The examination confirmed what the crime scene had already suggested. This had been a brutal, violent attack. Cristy had suffered a fractured jaw. The bone had been broken from a blow delivered with significant force. She had extensive blunt force trauma to her face, to the back of her head, and across her upper body. Dr. Ross identified deep marks around Cristy's neck. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation. Someone had choked the life out of her. The examination also confirmed that Cristy had been sexually assaulted before she was killed. Dr. Ross collected several biological samples during the autopsy, with the goal of creating a DNA profile of the perpetrator. In 1992, DNA technology was still relatively new to criminal investigations, but it was rapidly becoming one of the most powerful tools available to law enforcement. The samples were sent to the FBI for analysis. Technicians extracted DNA from the biological fluids and created a genetic profile, a unique fingerprint belonging to the man who had killed Christy Mirack. But there was a problem. The FBI's DNA database, known as CODIS, was still in its infancy in 1992. It contained profiles from convicted offenders in only 12 states. When Cristy's evidence was submitted and the unknown profile was run through the system, the result came back negative. No match. The DNA belonged to a man who had never been convicted of a crime, at least not in any of the 12 states contributing data to the system. The profile was saved, stored in a file. But without a name to attach to it, without a face, the DNA was nothing more than numbers on a page. The investigators had a perfect genetic snapshot of their suspect. They just had no idea who he was. Frustrated by the lack of progress and by Daniel Daddario's airtight alibi, detectives turned their attention to another person who had been at the center of this case from the beginning. Harry Goodman, the principal who had discovered Cristy's body. On December 23rd, 2 days after the murder, Harry was asked to come to the police station for questioning. When he arrived, the atmosphere was markedly different. This was not a friendly conversation. This was an interrogation. Harry was seated at a metal table. His fingerprints were taken, and then the questions began. "How would you describe your relationship with Christy Mirack?" one detective asked, his tone flat but with an edge of suspicion. "We were colleagues," Harry replied. "She was one of my best teachers." "I've told you this already." "Did you find her attractive?" Harry shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. "She was a beautiful woman, yes. But that's not—" "Did you ever have any physical contact with her?" the detective interrupted. "Any kind of sexual relationship?" "No," Harry said firmly. "Never." The detectives leaned in. "Do you think it's normal, Harry, for a school principal to drive to a teacher's house just because she's a little late for work? Most bosses would just wait for a phone call, But you were at her door by 9 o'clock. That seems very personal." Harry struggled to maintain his composure. "I knew she didn't have anyone else in town. I knew she would never be late without a reason. I was worried about her. That's all." But the detectives weren't satisfied. They pushed harder, questioning his motives, his actions, his presence at the crime scene. They suggested perhaps his concern was more than professional. Harry's responses remained consistent. He had nothing to hide. He had simply been doing what any responsible principal would do. Eventually, the detectives asked Harry to take a polygraph test. He agreed without hesitation. And just like Daniel Daddario before him, Harry Goodman passed the test. With no physical evidence linking him to the crime, with a passed polygraph, and with no inconsistencies in his story, Harry Goodman was also eliminated as a suspect. The investigation, barely a week old, was already running out of leads. On December 26, 1992, 5 days after her murder, Christy Mirack's funeral was held in Shamokin, the small mountain town where she had grown up. The service was held at a local church, and it was packed. Friends from childhood, relatives from across Pennsylvania, colleagues from Rohrerstown Elementary, students and parents whose lives Christy had touched. The grief in that room was overwhelming. Christy had been just 25 years old. She had barely begun her career. She had so much life ahead of her. And now, she was gone. While the community mourned, the police continued their investigation with increasing desperation. By March of 1993, just 3 months after the murder, investigators had conducted more than 500 interviews. They were chasing every lead, no matter how small. During this period, they uncovered reports of a stalker who had been operating in the East Lampeter Township area around the time of Christie's murder. Multiple women had reported being followed, being watched, being approached by a man whose behavior was unsettling. The detectives pursued these leads aggressively, hoping they would connect to the man in the white car that the neighbor had seen. But once again, the trail went cold. The stalker, if he existed, seemed to have vanished. As the months turned into years, the case began to cool. The initial wave of tips slowed to a trickle. The media attention faded. Other crimes demanded the department's resources. By 1995, 3 years after the murder, the number of interviews had reached 1,500. 60 individuals had been identified as potential suspects. Each one was systematically investigated. Backgrounds were checked. Alibis were verified. DNA samples were collected and compared, and one by one, each suspect was cleared. The detectives were left with a DNA profile that seemed to lead nowhere, and a family that was growing increasingly frustrated. The case of Christy Mirack was officially classified as cold. By the mid-90s, the investigation into Christy Mirack's murder had essentially stalled. The physical evidence sat in storage, carefully preserved but untouched. The DNA profile remained in the database, waiting for a match that never came. And the detectives moved on to other investigations, though they never forgot about Christy. One person, however, refused to let the case fade. Vince Mirack, Christy's brother, made it his mission to keep his sister's name alive. He called the police regularly, sometimes once a month, sometimes more often. He wasn't accusatory. He wasn't angry. He simply wanted to know if there had been any progress. The detectives appreciated Vince's persistence. It kept Christy's case on their minds, even as years passed. But while Vince fought to keep the investigation alive, the Mirack family was enduring a more private tragedy. Christy's mother had been diagnosed with cancer. The disease was aggressive. She underwent treatment, endured chemotherapy, and eventually reached remission. For a while, it seemed like she might beat it, but the cancer returned. It always returned. It would recede for a year, sometimes 2, giving the family brief periods of hope, only to come back stronger. Throughout this cycle of illness and recovery, the weight of Christy's unsolved murder remained constant. It was a wound that never healed. Christy's mother once told Vince that the not knowing was almost worse than the loss itself. If she knew who had killed her daughter, if she knew why, she could find some way to make peace with it. But the uncertainty, the faceless monster who had destroyed her family and then vanished, it was unbearable. in December of 2002. Exactly 10 years after Cristy was murdered, her mother's health finally failed. The cancer had spread. The treatments were no longer working. The doctors had run out of options. In her final days, as she lay in a hospital bed surrounded by her family, she made one last request to Vince. She asked him to never give up. She asked him to keep fighting for answers, to keep Cristy's memory alive, to never let the case be forgotten. And then she passed away, her heart still broken, never knowing the identity of the man who had taken her daughter. In the days following the funeral, Lancaster Online, a local newspaper that had covered Cristy's case since 1992, published a brief interview with Vince. He spoke about how the unanswered questions had weighed on his mother, how the stalled investigation had compounded her illness, how she had died without the closure she desperately needed. He said that his mother's final wish had now become his responsibility. He would not give up. He would not let Cristy be forgotten. And he meant it. By 2007, 15 years had passed since Christy Mirack's murder. The community of Lancaster had largely moved on. New families had moved into the area. Children who had been born after Cristy's death were now in high school. The crime had faded into local history. But for those who remembered, there remained a lingering sense of unease. Because no stranger had ever been caught, there was an unspoken fear that the killer was still there. A neighbor, a co-worker, someone living a normal life while carrying a terrible secret. This fear was not paranoia. Though no one knew it at the time, the man who had murdered Christy Mirack was indeed still living in Lancaster, performing at weddings and nightclubs as though he had never committed one of the most brutal crimes in the county's history. In 2007, Vince Mirack decided it was time to try something new, something bold. He reached out to the family of Linda Stoltzfus, another young woman whose murder in Lancaster County remained unsolved. Together, the two families pooled their resources and funded a large billboard along one of Lancaster's primary highways. The billboard was impossible to miss. It featured large photographs of both women, young and smiling, and beneath those photographs was a simple, haunting question. Do you know who killed us? Below the question was contact information for both families and for the police department. The campaign was born of desperate hope, the hope that seeing these faces every single day would eventually wear down the conscience of someone who knew something. Maybe a friend of the killer, maybe a family member, maybe the killer himself. The billboard generated attention. Local news stations ran stories about it. The families gave interviews, and the police department received a new wave of phone calls and tips. But as investigators followed each lead, they encountered the same frustrating pattern. Lots of speculation, lots of theories, but no concrete evidence, no credible witnesses, no breakthrough. Still, the billboard remained, a silent monument to two unsolved murders, a reminder that some wounds never heal, a plea for justice that would go unanswered for another 11 years. In October of 2015, 23 years after Christy Mirack's murder, the investigation was transferred to the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office. This transfer represented a shift in strategy. The District Attorney's Office had resources and connections that local police departments sometimes lacked. The office was led by District Attorney Craig Stedman, who had grown up in Lancaster County. He had been in high school when Cristy was murdered. The case had haunted the community throughout his adolescence and into his career. Stedman made the Mirack case a priority. He believed that the forensic samples collected in 1992 held the key, and he believed that advancing DNA technology would finally allow investigators to identify the unknown man. Two detectives from the District Attorney's Office had recently attended a law enforcement conference. There, they learned about a company called Parabon Nanolabs, a private laboratory in Virginia that specialized in DNA phenotyping. The laboratory offered a service called Snapshot. Using a DNA sample, the Snapshot program could predict the probable physical appearance of the person whose DNA it was analyzing. The technology worked by analyzing specific genetic markers that correlate with physical traits. It could determine skin tone, eye color, hair color, and certain facial features. It could identify a person's ancestral origins. The technology had limitations. It couldn't account for environmental factors. It couldn't tell you if someone was overweight or thin, if they had scars, if they wore glasses. But it could give investigators a starting point. The district attorney's office submitted the DNA evidence from Christy's case to Parabon Nanolabs. For the next 2 years, the team worked with the resulting data. In March of 2017, 25 years after the murder, they decided to apply an aging algorithm to the composite images. They knew the killer had likely been close to Christy's age at the time of the murder, which would place him in his late 40s or early 50s by 2017. However, because Christy had previously been involved with Daniel Daddario, a man 20 years her senior, they also considered the possibility the perpetrator might be older. The final composite images depicted what the suspect might look like at various ages, ranging from 45 to 55 years old. The images showed a man with dark hair, darker skin tone consistent with Latino or Mediterranean ancestry, and strong facial features. He looked like someone you might pass on the street. He looked ordinary, and that made the images even more unsettling. Initially, these composite images were shown only to Christy's family and to people who had known her in 1992. The hope was that someone would recognize the face, but no one recognized him. The composites generated no leads. So on November 1st, 2017, the district attorney's office made the decision to go public. They held a press conference. They released the composite images to every media outlet in Lancaster County. They asked the public for help. "Someone knows this man," District Attorney Craig Stedman told the assembled reporters. "He has a family. He has friends. He has co-workers. And we believe that someone out there will recognize him." The press conference generated significant media coverage. The composite images were shown on local television news, printed in newspapers, shared on social media. But despite the widespread coverage, despite the thousands of people who saw the images, no one came forward with a credible identification. The composite images, as advanced as they were, still weren't enough to crack the case. What the investigators needed was something more, something revolutionary. And in April of 2018, that technology finally arrived. On April 25th, 2018, Vince Mirack was at home watching the evening news. The lead story that night wasn't local, it was national, and it was about a case that had captivated the public for decades. The Golden State Killer, a serial rapist and murderer who had terrorized California in the 1970s and 80s, had finally been caught. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. He was a 72-year-old former police officer living quietly in suburban Sacramento. But what made the story truly remarkable wasn't just that he had been identified after more than 40 years. It was how he had been caught. Investigators had used a technique called genetic genealogy. They had taken DNA from one of the crime scenes and uploaded it to a public genetic database called GEDmatch, a website where people voluntarily submit their DNA profiles to trace their family trees. The DNA didn't match the Golden State Killer himself, but it matched several of his distant cousins, people who had submitted their own DNA and had no idea they were related to a serial killer. From there, investigators worked with genetic genealogists to build family trees, tracing connections backward through generations until they identified a suspect. As Vince watched the news coverage, something clicked in his mind. If this technology could identify the Golden State Killer after 40 years, why couldn't it identify his sister's killer after 26? He immediately sat down at his computer and sent an email to Detective Christopher Loff and District Attorney Craig Stedman. "Did you see the news?" he wrote. "Can we do this for Cristy?" As it turned out, the investigators were already thinking along the same lines. Just days after the Golden State Killer's arrest made headlines, Parabon Nanolabs reached out to the Lancaster County District Attorney's office. They offered their services in genetic genealogy, the exact same technique that had been used in California. The laboratory prepared Christy's DNA sample and uploaded it to GEDmatch, searching for matches among millions of people who had voluntarily submitted their genetic profiles. The task of analyzing the results was given to C.C. Moore, one of the most prominent genetic genealogists in the country. Moore had worked on hundreds of cases, helping law enforcement identify suspects in cold cases. When Moore examined the DNA matches from Christy's case, she didn't find the suspect himself. That would have been too easy. But she found something almost as valuable. She found several individuals who were identified as the suspect's close cousins, second cousins, third cousins, people who shared enough genetic material to indicate they had common ancestors. This was the breakthrough the case needed. C.C. Moore began the painstaking process of reverse genealogy. She started building family trees, working backward through generations to find the common ancestors that connected these cousins to the unknown suspect. It was meticulous work. It required combing through birth records, death certificates, marriage licenses, census data, newspaper archives, and social media profiles. It required building family trees with hundreds, sometimes thousands of individuals. Moore's research eventually focused on a specific family in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The family had roots in Eastern Europe, which aligned with some of the genetic markers in the suspect's profile. But she needed something more specific. She needed a detail that would allow her to narrow the field even further. Years earlier, the snapshot phenotyping had indicated that the suspect possessed significant Latino ancestry, specifically from Puerto Rico. This was an unusual combination. Eastern European ancestry mixed with Puerto Rican heritage. Moore began searching for connections between the Lancaster family she was investigating and Puerto Rican heritage. She scoured social media profiles. She searched through local newspapers. She looked for obituaries, wedding announcements, anything that might provide a clue. And then she found it. A local newspaper article from several years earlier featured a man who lived and worked in the Lancaster community. The article was lighthearted, a profile piece about local residents and their favorite recipes. In the article, the man discussed his love for cooking traditional Puerto Rican dishes. He explained that his father had been born in Puerto Rico and had immigrated to the United States as a young man. The man's name was Raymond Charles Rowe. Moore immediately cross-referenced the name with her family tree research. It fit. The timeline fit. The ancestry fit. The geographic location fit. To confirm her findings, Moore compared the suspect's DNA profile to a genetic profile on GEDmatch that belonged to a woman identified as Raymond Rowe's half-sister. The woman had uploaded her DNA to the site years earlier, simply hoping to learn more about her family history. When Moore ran the comparison, the genetic markers aligned with mathematical precision. The relationship was confirmed. The unknown suspect and this woman were indeed half-siblings. For the first time in 26 years, the nameless DNA profile from Christy Mirack's carpet had a name: Raymond Charles Rowe. When District Attorney Craig Stedman and Detective Christopher Loff learned that Raymond Rowe was their suspect, they were struck by one overwhelming realization. He had never left Lancaster. For 26 years, while investigators searched databases, interviewed suspects, and chased leads across multiple states, Raymond Rowe had been right there, living openly, building a life, building a career. He was known throughout Lancaster County by his stage name, DJ Freeze. He had built a successful business as a mobile disc jockey, performing at weddings, birthday parties, school events, and nightclubs. People liked DJ Freeze. He was the guy who got the dance floor moving, who read the crowd, who made celebrations memorable. He had thousands of satisfied customers over the years, and all the while he was carrying the secret of what he had done on the morning of December 21st, 1992. A review of Raymond Rowe's background revealed why he had never appeared on the investigative radar. He had no criminal record, not even a minor offense, no arrests, no convictions, nothing that would have triggered his DNA to be entered into any law enforcement database. In 1992, at the time of Christy's murder, Rowe had been just 23 or 24 years old. He lived approximately 4 miles from Christy's condominium. He frequently performed at local nightclubs, including several establishments that Christy was known to frequent. It was entirely possible, even likely, that Rowe and Christy had crossed paths at some point. Maybe they had been at the same bar on the same night. Maybe they had spoken briefly. Maybe he had simply seen her and become fixated, but there was no documented relationship between them. No one who knew both of them could recall ever seeing them together. This suggested a terrifying possibility: that Christy's murder wasn't the result of a relationship gone wrong or a personal dispute. It appeared to be a predatory attack, possibly the result of stalking. But identifying Raymond Rowe and proving that Raymond Rowe was the killer were two different things. Genetic genealogy had given investigators a name, but it wasn't admissible evidence in court. To make an arrest, to bring charges, to secure a conviction, they needed a direct DNA match. They needed a sample of Raymond Rowe's DNA that could be compared to the profile from the crime scene with absolute certainty. And they needed to obtain that sample without tipping him off, without giving him any indication that he was under investigation, without giving him the opportunity to flee. The investigators needed to conduct an undercover operation. On May 31, 2018, the Pennsylvania State Police, working with the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office, launched a covert surveillance operation targeting Raymond Rowe. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. They needed Rowe's DNA, and the easiest way to obtain it was to collect something he had touched and discarded. A cup, a water bottle, a utensil. The investigators learned that Rowe was scheduled to perform at an event at a local elementary school. It was a family-friendly event, and DJ Freeze would be there providing music and entertainment. The irony was not lost on the investigators. Raymond Rowe, who had murdered a 6th-grade teacher, was now performing at an elementary school, surrounded by the same kind of children Cristy had dedicated her life to teaching. An undercover female officer was assigned to the operation. She arrived at the school dressed casually, blending in with the parents and staff. She positioned herself near where Rowe was setting up his equipment, and she struck up a casual conversation with him. Rowe was friendly and talkative. He had no reason to be suspicious. People talked to him at events all the time. It was part of the job. He joked with the officer, talked about the music he was planning to play, and made small talk. The officer kept him engaged while simultaneously keeping close watch on his movements throughout the event. She noted everything he touched, everything he drank from, everything he might potentially discard. When the event concluded and Rowe began packing up his equipment, the officer maintained her distance but kept him in sight. Rowe carried a few items over to a trash receptacle near the school entrance. He tossed them in and then returned to finish loading his van. The moment Rowe drove away, the officer moved quickly to the trash receptacle. She put on gloves, carefully sorted through the contents, and retrieved 3 items that Rowe had discarded: a plastic water bottle, a disposable cup, and a piece of chewing gum. The items were immediately placed in evidence bags and transported to the laboratory for analysis. The DNA extraction and comparison took several days. The technicians worked carefully, knowing that this evidence would need to withstand scrutiny in court. Finally, the results came back. The DNA from the water bottle, the cup, and the chewing gum all matched the DNA profile from Christy Mirack's crime scene. It wasn't a partial match. It wasn't a probabilistic match. It was a definitive, 100% match. Raymond Charles Rowe was the man who had murdered Christy Mirack on December 21st, 1992. On June 25th, 2018, 26 years, 6 months, and 4 days after Christy Mirack was murdered, Raymond Rowe was brought in for questioning. Rowe was not under arrest at this point. He had been asked to come to the station voluntarily. He agreed, likely assuming it was some minor matter. He was placed in an interrogation room equipped with video and audio recording equipment. Detective Christopher Loff and another investigator sat down across from Rowe and began the interview. Initially, the questions were routine. Rowe was asked about his background, his business, his family. The tone was conversational, almost friendly. Then the questions shifted. Did Rowe know a woman named Christy Mirack? Rowe said he did not. The name meant nothing to him. Had he ever been to a condominium complex in East Lampeter Township? Rowe said he couldn't recall. The detectives showed him a photograph of Christy Mirack, taken when she was alive, smiling, full of life. Rowe studied the photograph. He shook his head. He said he didn't recognize her. Then the detectives mentioned the reports of a stalker operating in the East Lampeter Township area in the early 1990s. They asked if Rowe had ever been accused of following women. Rowe's demeanor shifted. He became defensive. He said he had never stalked anyone. He said he didn't appreciate the implication. The detectives then asked about Rowe's vehicle in 1992. What kind of car had he been driving? There was a long pause. Rowe seemed to understand that the questions were no longer general. They were specific. They were pointed. He admitted that he had owned a white Toyota Celica in 1992. The detectives nodded. They explained that a witness had seen a white car parked near Christy's condominium on the morning she was killed. They explained that a man matching Rowe's description had been seen walking toward Christy's residence. Rowe insisted he didn't know what they were talking about. He said he had never been to that complex. He said they had the wrong person. Then the detectives revealed what they knew. They told Rowe about the DNA evidence collected from the crime scene in 1992. They told him about the genealogy investigation. They told him about the undercover operation at the elementary school, about the water bottle and the cup and the piece of chewing gum. And they told him that his DNA was a perfect match to the DNA found at the scene of Christy Mirack's murder. The room fell silent. Rowe sat there staring at the table, his face unreadable. He didn't deny it. He didn't confess. He simply sat there. The interview concluded shortly thereafter. Raymond Rowe was placed under arrest and charged with criminal homicide in the death of Christy Mirack. As he was led out in handcuffs, detectives noted that he showed no visible emotion, no tears, no anger, no remorse, just silence. The arrest of Raymond Rowe sent shockwaves through Lancaster County. For those who remembered Christy Mirack's murder, the news brought a mixture of relief and disbelief. Relief that the case had finally been solved. Disbelief that the killer had been living among them all along. For Vince Mirack, the arrest brought emotions that were almost impossible to articulate. After 26 years of waiting, of calling the police for updates, of keeping his mother's final wish alive, he finally had an answer. But that answer came with its own kind of pain. His mother had died 16 years earlier, never knowing who had killed her daughter. She had spent the last decade of her life consumed by that question. Vince couldn't help but think about what it would have meant to her to know the truth, to see the man arrested, to see justice finally served. But she was gone. On January 8th, 2019, 7 months after his arrest, Raymond Rowe appeared in court for his plea hearing. Faced with overwhelming DNA evidence and with the very real possibility of receiving the death penalty if the case went to trial, Rowe made a decision. He pleaded guilty to charges of criminal homicide, sexual assault, and burglary. In exchange for the guilty plea, the death penalty was taken off the table. Rowe was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. An additional 60 to 120 years were added to his sentence. During the sentencing hearing, Rowe was given the opportunity to make a statement. He declined. He offered no explanation for why he had killed Christy Mirack. He offered no apology to her family. He provided no insight into his motive. He simply stood there, silent and expressionless, as the judge handed down the sentence. Vince Mirack was present in the courtroom that day. After the sentence was read, he spoke briefly to reporters outside the courthouse. "My mother never got to see this day," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She died waiting for answers. But I know she's watching now, and I know she can finally rest." The legal battle did not end with Raymond Rowe's conviction. In November of 2020, nearly 2 years after his sentencing, Rowe filed a post-conviction petition. He was seeking to have his sentence overturned or reduced, claiming that his guilty plea had been coerced. In late 2021, Rowe appeared in court for a hearing on his petition, and in a stunning reversal, he claimed that he was innocent of murdering Christy Mirack. Rowe alleged that his previous attorneys had pressured him into accepting the plea deal while he was in a severely weakened physical and mental state. He claimed he had lost 25 kilograms, roughly 55 pounds, due to chronic stress and intestinal problems while in custody. Rowe offered a new version of events. He claimed that he had met Christy at a bar sometime before her death. He said they had engaged in a consensual encounter in her condominium just hours before she was killed. He maintained that someone else, some unknown person, had murdered Cristy after he had left. It was a desperate attempt to explain away the DNA evidence while claiming innocence. Roe's attorneys requested that new DNA testing be performed on items from the crime scene. They wanted the wooden cutting board tested. They wanted the toaster tested. They wanted every piece of Cristy's clothing re-examined. The petition was heard by Lancaster County Judge Dennis Reinecker. In April of 2022, Judge Reinecker issued his ruling. He denied Roe's petition in its entirety. The judge ruled that Roe's new claims did not meet the legal standard required for post-conviction DNA testing. Under Pennsylvania law, such testing is only granted if there is a reasonable possibility that the new evidence would prove the defendant's innocence. Judge Reinecker found that given the totality of the evidence, including the DNA match, the timeline established by witnesses, Roe's admission that he owned a white Toyota Celica, and the lack of any credible alternative explanation, there was no reasonable possibility that additional testing would exonerate him. The petition was denied. The conviction stood. Raymond Charles Roe remains incarcerated today, serving his life sentence without the possibility of parole at a Pennsylvania state correctional facility. He is now in his mid-50s. He will die in prison. Christy Mirack's case represents both a triumph and a tragedy. It is a triumph of modern forensic science, of genetic genealogy, of investigators who refused to give up even when the trail seemed hopelessly cold. It demonstrates the power of technology to finally bring justice to victims and their families, even decades after a crime has been committed. But it is also a tragedy that speaks to the limitations of the criminal justice system as it existed in 1992. If Raymond Roe had committed even a minor crime before Cristy's murder, if he had been arrested for any offense that would have required his DNA to be entered into a database, he might have been caught immediately. Cristy might have been his only victim. The Mirack family might have had closure within months rather than decades. Instead, because Roe had no criminal record, his DNA profile remained invisible to law enforcement for 26 years. He lived freely in the community he had terrorized, building a business, entertaining at celebrations, presenting a smiling face to the world. And Cristy's mother, who fought cancer for years while desperately hoping to see justice for her daughter, died without ever knowing who had destroyed her family. The case also highlights the revolutionary potential of genetic genealogy as an investigative tool. The technique that solved Cristy's case has since been used to identify suspects in hundreds of other cold cases across the country. It has brought closure to families who had given up hope. But it also raises important questions about privacy, about the implications of public DNA databases, about the balance between solving crimes and protecting individual rights. These are complex questions that our society is still grappling with. What is certain, however, is that Christy Mirack deserved better. She deserved to live. She deserved to continue teaching, to continue inspiring her students, to build the family she had dreamed of. She deserved a future that was stolen from her on a cold December morning, just 4 days before Christmas, by a man who thought he could hide in plain sight forever. But the truth, as it always does, eventually found its way into the light. Raymond Roe's 26 years of freedom came to an end, not because he made a mistake, not because he confessed, but because science caught up with him. Because genetic genealogy gave a voice to DNA evidence that had been silent for more than 2 decades. Because a family refused to give up. And because investigators finally had the tools they needed to unmask a killer who had been hiding among them all along. Thank you for joining me for this episode of The Untold Cold Case. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the importance of never giving up the search for truth, I want to ask you to do something right now. Hit that like button. It tells me that this content matters to you, and it helps more people discover these forgotten stories. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me your thoughts on Cristy's case. Tell me if you remember when this happened. And most importantly, hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications. Because every week we're bringing you new cases, new stories, new reminders that justice, even when it's delayed, is still worth fighting for. This has been The Untold Cold Case. Stay safe out there, hold your loved ones close, and remember that the truth, no matter how deeply it's buried, has a way of rising to the surface. Until next time.